Springfield, Massachusetts. December 1891. The gym is cold enough to see your breath. It smells like sawdust and sweat. 18 restless young men are pacing the floor, bored out of their minds, waiting for their instructor to give them something, anything, to do. Then a man nails 2 peach baskets to a 10-foot elevated track. The room goes quiet. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. No professionals to copy. No stadiums to dream about. No jerseys, no scoreboards. Just a soccer ball, 2 fruit baskets, and a handwritten list of 13 rules. It should have stayed a gym exercise for bored students. It didn't. What started in that cold room would grow into a sport worth billions of dollars, played on every continent, and watched by hundreds of millions of people. It would produce some of the most famous human beings who ever lived. So how did 2 peach baskets change the world? Before basketball had a name, American athletes had a problem that nobody talked about. Football season ended. Baseball stopped. And when winter came, physical education programs across the country shut down completely. Students grew restless. Coaches grew frustrated. Gyms sat empty while the cold kept everyone inside. Something needed to fill the gap. The job fell to one man, a young Canadian physical education teacher who had been handed an almost impossible task. Invent a game that could be played indoors. Keep students moving and interested. And make sure it was nothing like the rough, physical collisions of football. He had 2 weeks to figure it out. What he came up with would eventually become the most watched sport in American history. But before any of that happened, he almost quit before the first game was ever played. James Naismith was running out of time. His supervisor at the YMCA training school had given him a simple but frustrating problem to solve. The young men in his physical education class were restless and difficult to manage. The cold weather had pushed everyone indoors, and the usual outdoor activities were no longer possible. 2 previous instructors had already tried to keep this same group busy and had both walked away defeated. Now it was Naismith's turn, and the pressure was real. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever he came up with had to work in a gym. It had to keep a large group of young men moving and focused. And it could not be the kind of rough, physical game that always ended with someone getting hurt. So he started eliminating ideas one by one. Football was too violent for an indoor space. Soccer required too much room. Lacrosse was too dangerous. Every existing sport he considered had at least one problem that made it wrong for what he needed. So instead of borrowing someone else's game, Naismith decided to build something from scratch. He thought about what made a game fair and exciting. He decided the goal should be elevated rather than placed on the ground. That one choice changed everything. If players had to throw the ball upward instead of driving it forward with force, then skill and accuracy would matter more than size and strength. A smaller player could compete. A smarter player could win. He wrote down 13 rules in a single sitting. They were short, clear, and easy to understand. No running with the ball. No hitting other players. Score by getting the ball into the basket. The rules were simple enough that anyone could learn them in minutes. Then came the first game. It was chaos. 18 players crammed onto the gym floor, chasing a soccer ball with almost no idea what they were doing. And every single time someone scored, the game had to stop completely. The peach baskets still had their bottoms attached, which meant the ball got stuck inside after every goal. Someone had to drag a ladder across the floor and climb up to retrieve it before play could continue. It was clunky, slow, and nothing close to the smooth game people know today. But the players loved it anyway. They talked about it after class. They came back the next day asking to play again. Word moved through the school quickly, and students who had never shown interest in physical education were suddenly showing up to watch. The game had a creator, and it had its first fans. But it was still trapped inside one cold gymnasium, and the world had no idea it existed yet. Nobody planned for basketball to spread the way it did. There was no marketing campaign, no television deal, no organization pushing the game into new cities. What happened instead was much simpler, and in many ways much more powerful. The students at the YMCA training school in Springfield went home. That was it. These were young men who had been trained to become physical education instructors. When they finished their studies, they returned to their home cities and towns across the United States and Canada, and they brought Naismith's game with them. They taught it in their local YMCAs the same way they had learned it, with a soccer ball, a pair of baskets, and 13 rules. Their students then taught it to others. Those people taught it to more. The game moved from city to city not because anyone was pushing it, but because everyone who played it wanted to share it. Within a single year, basketball was being played across the United States and Canada. By 1893, just 2 years after that first chaotic game in a cold gymnasium, it had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. YMCA branches in France, England, China, and India were introducing the sport to people who had never heard of Springfield, Massachusetts. A game invented to fill a winter afternoon was now being played on the other side of the world. And it wasn't only young men who were playing. Just months after Naismith nailed those peach baskets to the wall, a physical education teacher named Senda Berenson read about the game and immediately saw something in it. She introduced basketball to her students at Smith College in Massachusetts in 1892, making it one of the first organized sports widely available to women in America. The women who played it were just as enthusiastic as the men. Basketball, it turned out, did not belong to any one group of people. It belonged to anyone who could throw a ball. But the faster the game spread, the messier things became. Every YMCA had its own version. Every school made small adjustments to the rules. Some allowed more physical contact. Others changed how many players could be on the floor. A few modified the scoring system entirely. When teams from different cities met to play, they often spent more time arguing about the rules than actually playing the game. It was a familiar problem. A great idea had reached more people than its creator ever expected, but nobody was in charge of protecting what made it great in the first place. The sport was growing in every direction at once, with no single voice guiding it. Basketball was everywhere. Its name was on the lips of players from Canada to China, from college campuses to community gyms. But underneath all that excitement, something was quietly breaking down. Without a shared set of rules that everyone agreed to follow, basketball wasn't really one sport anymore. It was a dozen different games wearing the same name. The game needed someone to take control. The problem was that two very powerful groups both thought that someone should be them. On one side stood the Amateur Athletic Union, known as the AAU. They were an established organization that already governed several sports across the country, and they believed basketball naturally fell under their authority. On the other side were the colleges and universities where basketball was quickly becoming one of the most popular activities on campus. College programs had their own ideas about how the game should be played, and they had no interest in handing that power to anyone else. The arguments between them were not small ones. Take dribbling, for example. In the earliest version of basketball, players were not allowed to dribble at all. You caught the ball and either passed it or shot it. Then some versions of the game began allowing a single bounce. Others allowed more. The AAU had one position on this. The colleges had another. Players moving between different competitions never quite knew what was allowed and what wasn't. The same disagreements existed over how many players belonged on the court at one time. Early games had been played with 9 players per side because Naismith had 18 students and simply split them into 2 equal groups. But was 9 the right number? Some organizations said yes. Others were already experimenting with 7 or 6 or 5. College basketball began slowly pulling ahead in this power struggle simply by doing something the AAU was slower to embrace. It competed publicly. In 1896, the University of Chicago faced off against the University of Iowa in what is widely recognized as the first intercollegiate basketball game. People came to watch. They cheered. They picked sides. Suddenly basketball wasn't just something you played, it was something you watched and cared about. More college games followed. More fans showed up. And as intercollegiate competition grew, the need for a single consistent set of rules became impossible to ignore. The NCAA eventually stepped in and worked toward creating a national standard that colleges across the country could follow. The fights didn't disappear overnight, but slowly, the chaos began to settle. For the first time, a player in one city could travel to another city and recognize the game being played. The rules were the same. The court was the same. The basics were the same. Basketball had become something you could teach, practice, and build a team around without starting from scratch every time. One game. Shared rules. A real foundation. But the sport that had just found its footing was about to face something much harder than a disagreement over dribbling. It only belonged to certain people, and that was about to become a very serious problem. Basketball had found its rules. It had found its structure. What it hadn't found was fairness. From the very beginning, black players had been part of the game. They played in gyms, on outdoor courts, and in early local competitions with the same passion and skill as anyone else. But as basketball grew more organized and more profitable, the doors that had once been open began closing. By the 1920s, the formal leagues that were starting to take shape across the country were systematically shutting black players out. No formal announcement was made. No single rule was written down. The exclusion simply happened, enforced by habit, pressure, and the same racial attitudes that were poisoning American life far beyond the basketball court. But being excluded from a league did not mean being absent from the game. In 1923, a group of black players in New York City formed a team that would quietly become one of the greatest in the country. The Harlem Renaissance, known simply as the Rens, could not join the established leagues that were growing around them. So they did something else entirely. They traveled. They played anyone willing to face them, moving from city to city and gym to gym, beating opponents so regularly and so convincingly that it became difficult for even their harshest critics to deny what they were seeing. The Rens were not a curiosity. They were the best team in America. And almost nobody in the formal basketball world wanted to admit it. 3 years later, in 1926, another team emerged from the same environment. The Harlem Globetrotters began not as the entertaining show they would later become, but as a serious, highly competitive basketball team making the same point the Rens were already making. Black players belonged at the highest level of the sport. The results on the court proved it every single night. The institutions controlling professional basketball were slower to listen. The National Basketball League began a quiet and reluctant move toward integration in 1942, under pressure that had been building for years. In 1947, a Japanese-American player named Wataru Misaka broke another barrier when he played for the New York Knicks, becoming the first non-white player in what would become the NBA. These were real moments, but they were small and hard-won, arriving not out of generosity but out of the undeniable reality that the sport's best talent could no longer be ignored. The game was being transformed by the very players the leagues had tried to keep out. Integration was coming. But it would not arrive through the leagues that had spent decades resisting it. It would arrive inside a brand new organization that almost nobody expected to survive its first season. The NBA was not born out of vision. It was born out of desperation. In 1946, a group of arena owners across the northeastern United States had a problem that had nothing to do with basketball. They owned large indoor venues, stadiums built for hockey, and those buildings sat empty on nights when there was no game scheduled. Empty buildings made no money. So the arena owners came up with a practical solution. They would start a basketball league, fill their venues on off nights, and hopefully turn a profit. That league was called the Basketball Association of America, and sport was almost secondary to the business plan behind it. At the same time, another league called the National Basketball League was already operating in smaller Midwestern cities. The two organizations spent the late 1940s competing against each other for players, fans, and credibility, and both were struggling to survive. Rosters kept changing. Franchises folded without warning. Fans in some cities showed up in strong numbers while entire teams in other cities played in front of nearly empty seats. By 1949, it was clear that neither league could keep going the way things were. So they merged. The The Basketball Association of America absorbed most of the National Basketball League's surviving teams and renamed itself the National Basketball Association. The NBA had arrived, not with a celebration, but with a quiet sigh of relief from everyone involved. The early years were not pretty. Games were slow and deliberate. Teams that were protecting a lead would hold the ball for minutes at a time, passing it back and forth with no intention of shooting. Fans grew frustrated. Some booed. Others simply stopped coming. The sport that had once excited everyone who encountered it was in danger of boring the very people it needed to survive. Then came a game that made the problem impossible to ignore any longer. In 1950, the Fort Wayne Pistons faced the Minneapolis Lakers and deliberately slowed the game to a crawl, holding the ball for long stretches to protect a narrow lead. The final score was 19-18. A professional basketball game had ended with fewer combined points than a typical quarter looks like today. The reaction from fans and league officials was immediate and angry. For years later, in 1954, the NBA introduced the 24-second shot clock. Teams now had just 24 seconds to attempt a shot or give up possession. Overnight, the game opened up. Players drove to the basket. Scores climbed. The pace became faster and more exciting than anything fans had seen before. The NBA had saved itself with a single rule change. But its greatest era, and the player who would carry it to the entire world, hadn't arrived yet. The shot clock had given basketball its speed. What it needed next was its soul. That soul arrived in the form of two men who could not have been more different from each other, competing at the highest level of the sport at exactly the same time. Their rivalry would not just define an era. It would teach the world what basketball could mean. Bill Russell arrived in the NBA in 1956 and immediately changed what people thought winning looked like. He was not the most explosive scorer on the floor. He did not chase personal records or individual glory. What Russell did was defend, rebound, and make every single player around him better. He was the center of a Boston Celtics team that became the most dominant dynasty professional basketball had ever seen, winning 11 championships in 13 years. 11. In 13 years. Russell's message was clear and consistent. The team was everything. The system was everything. One player's greatness meant nothing if it didn't lead to a championship. Then there was Wilt Chamberlain. Where Russell represented the power of the group, Chamberlain represented something else entirely, the breathtaking, almost impossible potential of a single human being. On March 2, 1962, playing for the Philadelphia Warriors against the New York Knicks, Chamberlain scored 100 points in a single game. 100. No other player in NBA history has come close to matching it. That number didn't just enter the record books. It entered basketball mythology, the kind of achievement so far beyond normal that people still talk about it as if it couldn't possibly be real. Russell versus Chamberlain. Team versus individual. Defense versus offense. Selflessness versus spectacle. Basketball had found its first great argument, and fans loved every second of it. But while the NBA was celebrating its legends, a rival league decided the sport still wasn't exciting enough. The American Basketball Association launched in 1967 with a very different idea of what professional basketball should look like. The ABA introduced the three-point line, rewarding long-range shooting that the NBA had never considered valuable. It created the slam dunk contest, turning individual athleticism into pure entertainment. It played with a red, white, and blue ball. It was louder, flashier, and more theatrical than anything the established league was offering. The NBA resisted all of it at first. But by 1976, with both leagues financially exhausted from competing against each other, a merger brought the ABA's best teams, and its best ideas, into the NBA fold. The three-point line, the dunk contest, the entertainment philosophy. All of it came with them. Basketball had its legends and its style. Now it needed the world to know their names. Basketball had its style and its legends. What it didn't have yet was the rest of the world. That was about to change, and it started with two players who hadn't even turned professional yet. In 1979, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird faced each other in the NCAA championship game in what became the most watched college basketball game in television history up to that point. The country stopped to watch. When both men entered the NBA the following season, Magic with the Los Angeles Lakers, Bird with the Boston Celtics, they brought that national attention with them and reignited one of basketball's oldest rivalries. Their battles through the 1980s pulled the NBA out of a difficult financial period and turned professional basketball into must-watch television across America. But what Magic and Bird started, Michael Jordan finished. Jordan arrived in the NBA in 1984 and within a few years had become something the sport had never quite produced before. He was not just a basketball player. He was a cultural force. His 6 championships with the Chicago Bulls proved he was the best player alive. His Nike partnership produced one of the most successful shoe lines in human history. His face appeared in commercials, magazines, and movie theaters. Children in countries that barely followed basketball knew his name and wanted to wear his number. Then came the summer of 1992. The United States sent NBA players to the Olympics for the first time, assembling a roster so talented it became known simply as the Dream Team. Jordan, Magic, Bird, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, the greatest collection of basketball talent ever put on one court. They didn't just win the gold medal. They captivated the entire planet, winning every game by an average of nearly 44 points while fans from every competing nation asked for their autographs and photographs. The world had seen basketball before. Now it was completely in love with it. Players from Europe, South America, and Africa began entering the NBA in greater numbers through the late 1990s and 2000s. Dirk Nowitzki from Germany. Tony Parker from France. Manu Ginobili from Argentina. The sport that began in a Massachusetts gymnasium was now drawing its best talent from every corner of the earth. Television contracts grew enormous. Merchandise sold in every time zone. The NBA had become a multi-billion-dollar global business. Basketball was now a planet-wide religion. But its next revolution wouldn't come from a single player. It would come from a number. The next revolution didn't wear a jersey. It carried a spreadsheet. For most of basketball's history, coaches made decisions based on experience and instinct. They watched players, trusted their eyes, and went with their gut. Then data analysts began looking at the game differently, measuring not just what happened on the court but why certain actions led to wins more reliably than others. What they found quietly changed everything. Corner three-point shots and layups, it turned out, were mathematically the most efficient ways to score in basketball. The mid-range jump shot, that elegant, reliable weapon that players had spent decades perfecting, was producing fewer points per attempt than almost anything else on the floor. The numbers were clear, even if they were uncomfortable. The Golden State Warriors took those numbers and built a dynasty around them. Between 2015 and 2019 they won 3 championships by doing exactly what the data suggested, shooting more threes, attacking the basket, and spacing the floor in ways that older coaching philosophies had never prioritized. Basketball traditionalists were furious. Purists argued that the game was losing something beautiful. But the wins kept coming, and other teams had no choice but to follow. Behind the scenes, technology was reshaping the sport in other ways too. Motion capture systems and biomechanical data were being used to analyze how young players moved, shot, and trained. Artificial intelligence was helping coaches identify talent earlier and design training programs built around each individual athlete's body and tendencies. Players as young as 12 were being developed using tools that didn't exist a decade ago. And the game itself kept growing in new directions. Women's basketball reached heights that had been a long time coming. The WNBA grew steadily in both viewership and cultural importance, and in 2024 a player named Caitlin Clark arrived with such force that she introduced an entirely new generation of fans to the sport, many of whom came for the women's game first and never left. The NBA played games in Africa. Leagues across Asia and Europe continued to strengthen. Basketball's footprint kept widening with no sign of slowing down. James Naismith wrote 13 rules to fill a winter afternoon. He could never have imagined 450 million players across 6 continents. The baskets got taller. The players got faster. The money became unimaginable. But the game still comes down to the same thing it always did: put the ball in the hole, and don't let the other team do the same.